Chapter 33 of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was, as Andrew had understood for a long time, a sort of underground world of criminals, even here on the mountain desert. Otherwise the criminals could not have existed for even a moment in the face of the organized strength of lawful society. Several times in the course of his wanderings Andrew had come in contact with links of the underground chain, and he learned what every fugitive learns, the safe stopping points in the great circuit of his flight. Three elements went into the making of that hidden society. There was first of all the circulating and active part, and this was composed of men actually known to be under the ban of the law and openly defying it. Beneath this active group lay a stratum much larger, which served as a base for the operating criminals. This stratum was built entirely of men who had at one time been incriminated in shady dealings of one sort or another. It included lawbreakers from every part of the world, men who had fled first of all to the shelter of the mountain desert, and who had lived there until their past was even forgotten in the lands from which they came. But they had never lost the inevitable sympathy for their more active fellows, and in this class there was included a meaner element, men who had in the past committed crimes in the mountain desert itself, and who from time to time, when they saw an absolutely safe opportunity, were perfectly ready and willing to sin again. The third and largest of all the elements in the criminal world of the desert was a shifting and changing class of men who might be called the paid adherents of the active order. The long riders, acting in groups or singly, fled after the commission of a crime and were forced to find places of rest and concealment along their journey. Under this grave necessity they quickly learned what people on their way could be hired as hosts, and whose silence and passive aid could be bought. Such men were secured in the first place by handsome bribes, and very often they joined the ranks unwillingly. But when some peaceful householder was confronted by a desperate man armed, on a weary horse, perhaps stained from a wound, the householder was by no means ready to challenge the man's right to hospitality. He never knew when the stranger would take by force what was refused to him freely, and if the lawbreaker took by force, he was apt to cover his trail by a fresh killing. Of course, such killings took place only when the long rider was a desperate brute rather than a man, but enough of them had occurred to call up vivid examples to every householder who was accosted. As a rule, he submitted to receive the unwelcome guest. Also, as a rule, he was weak enough to accept a gift when the stranger parted. Once such a gift was taken, he was lost. His name was instantly passed on by the fugitive to his fellows as a safe man. Before long he became, against or with his will, a depository of secrets. Banned faces became known to him, and if he suddenly decided to withdraw from the criminal world, his case was most precarious. The long riders admitted no neutrals. If a man had once been with them, he could only leave them to become an enemy. He became open prey. His name was published abroad. Then his cattle were apt to disappear. His stacks of hay might catch fire unexpectedly at night. His house itself might be plundered, and in not infrequent cases the man himself was brutally murdered. It was part of a code no less binding because it was unwritten. All of this Andrew was more or less aware of, and scores of names had been mentioned to him by chance acquaintances of the road. Such names he stored away, for he had always felt that time impending of which Harry Allister had warned him, the time when he must openly forget his scruples and take to a career of crime. That time he now knew was come upon him. It would be misrepresenting Andrew to say that he shrank from the future. Rather, he accepted everything that lay before him wholeheartedly, and with the laying aside of his scruples there was an instant lightening of the heart, a fierce keenness of mind, a contempt for society, a disregard for life beginning with his own. One could have noted it in the recklessness with which he sent Sally up the slope away from the ranch house this night. He had made up his mind immediately to hunt out a safe man, recently mentioned to him by that unconscionable scapegrace, Harry Woods, crooked gambler, thief of small and large, and whilom murderer. The man's name was Gary Baldwin, a small rancher some half-day's ride above Sullivan's place in the valley. He was recommended as a man of silence. In that direction Andrew took his way, but coming in the hills to a dished-out place on a hillside where there was a natural shelter from both wind and rain, he stopped there for the rest of the night, cooked a meal, rolled himself in his blankets, and slept into the gray of the morning. No sooner was the first light streaking the horizon to the east than Andrew wakened. He saddled Sally and, after a leisurely breakfast, started at a jog trot through the hills, taking the upslope with the utmost care. For nothing so ruins a horse as hard work uphill at the very beginning of the day. He gave Sally her head, and by letting her go as she pleased, she topped the divide, breathing as easily as if she had been walking on the flat. She gave one toss of her head as she saw the long, smooth slope ahead of her, and then, without a word from Andrew or a touch of his heels, she gave herself up to the long, rocking canter which she could maintain so tirelessly for hour on hour. A clear, cold morning came on. Indeed, it was rarely chill for the mountain desert, with a feel of coming snow in the wind. Sally pricked one ear as she looked into the north, and Andrew knew that that was a sign of trouble coming. He came in the middle of the morning to the house of Gary Baldwin. It was a wretched shack. The roof sagged in the middle, and the building had been held from literally falling apart by bolting an iron rod through the length of it. A woman who fitted well into such a background kicked open the door and looked up to Andrew with the dishwater still dripping from her red hands. He asked for her husband. He was gone from the house. Where? She did not know. Somewhere yonder, and her gesture included half the width of the horizon to the west. There was his trail, if Andrew wished to follow it. For her part, she was busy and could not spare time to gossip. At that, she stepped back and kicked the door shut with a slam that set the whole side of the shack shivering. At that moment Andrew wondered what he would have done when he lived in Martindale if he had been treated in such a manner. He would have crimsoned to the eyes, no doubt, and fled from the virago. But now he felt neither embarrassment nor fear nor anger. He drew his revolver, and with the heavy butt banged loudly on the door. It left 3 deep dents in the wood, and the door was kicked open again. But this time he saw only the foot of the woman clad in a man's boot. The door remained open, but the hostess kept out of view. "You be riding on, friend," she called in her harsh voice. "Bud, keep out'n the kitchen. Stranger, you be riding on. I don't know you, and I don't want to know you. A man that beats on doors with his gun?" Andrew laughed, and the sound brought her into view. A furious face, but a curious face as well. She carried a long rifle slung easily under her stout arm. "What do you want with Gary?" she asked. And he replied with a voice equally hard, "I want directions for finding Scarface Allister." He watched that shot shake her. "You do? You've got a hell of a nerve asking around here for Allister. Slope, kid, slope. You're on a cold trail." "Wait a minute," protested Andrew. "You need another look at me." "I can see all there is of you the first glance," said the woman calmly. "Why should I look again?" "To see the reward," said Andrew bitterly. He laughed again. "I'm Andrew Lanning. Ever hear of me?" It was obvious that she had. She blinked and winced as though the name stunned her. "Lanning?" she said. "Why, you ain't much more'n a kid. Lanning? And you're him?" All at once she melted. "Slide off your hoss and come in, Andy," she said. "Dogged if I knew you at all." "Thanks. I want to find Allister, and I'm in a hurry." "So you and him are going to team it? That'll be high times. Come here, Bud. Look at Andy Lanning. That's him on the horse right before you." A scared, round face peered out at Andrew from behind his mother. "All right, partner. I'll tell you where to find him pretty close. He'll be up the gulch along about now. You know the old shack up there? You can get to him inside 3 hours with that hoss." She stopped and eyed Sally. "Is that the one that run Gray Peter to death? She doesn't look the part, but them long, low horses is deceivin'. Can't you stay, Andy? Well, so long. Give Allister a good word from Bess Baldwin. Luck." He waved and was gone at a brisk gallop. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was not yet noon when he entered the gulch. He was part way up the ravine when something moved at the top of the high wall to his right. He guessed at once that it was a lookout signaling the main party of the approach of a stranger. So Andrew stopped Sally with a word and held his hand high above his head, facing the point from which he had seen the movement. There was a considerable pause. Then a man showed on the top of the cliff, and Andrew recognized Jeff Rankin by his red hair. Yet they were at too great a distance for conversation, and after waving a greeting, Rankin merely beckoned Andrew on his way up the valley. Around the very next bend of the ravine he found the camp. It was of the most impromptu character, and the warning of Rankin had caused them to break it up precipitately, as Andrew could easily see, by one length of tarpaulin tossed without folding over a saddle. Each of the four was ready beside his horse for flight or for attack, as their outlook on the cliff should give signal. But at sight of Andrew and the bay mare, a murmur, then a growl of interest went among them. Even Larry la Roche grinned a skull-like welcome, and Henry Allister actually ran forward to receive the newcomer. Andrew dropped out of the saddle and shook hands with him. "I've done as you said I would," said Andrew. "I've run in a circle, Allister, and now I'm back to make one of you, if you still want me." Allister, laughing joyously, turned to the other three and repeated the question to them. There was only one voice in answer. "Want you?" said Allister, and his smile made Andrew almost forget the scar which twisted the otherwise handsome face. "Want you? Why, man, if we've been beyond the law up to this time, we can laugh at the law now. Sit down. Hey, Scotty, shake up the fire and put on some coffee, will you? We'll take an hour off." Larry la Roche was observed to make a dour face. "Who's to tell me it's lucky," he said, "to have a gent that starts out by making us all stop on the trail? Is that a good sign?" But Scotty, with laughter, hushed him. Yet Larry la Roche remained, of all the rest, quite silent during the making of the coffee and the drinking of it. The others kept up a running fire of comments and questions, but Larry la Roche, as though he had never forgiven Andrew for their first quarrel, remained with his long, bony chin dropped upon his breast and followed the movements of Andrew Lanning with restless eyes. The others were glad to see him, as Andrew could tell at a glance, but also they were a bit troubled, and by degrees he made out the reason. Strange as it seemed, they regretted that he had not been able to make his break across the mountains. His presence made them more impregnable than they had ever been, under the indomitable Allister, and yet, more than the aid of his fighting hand, they would have welcomed the tidings of a man who had broken away from the shadow of the law and made good. For each of the falling wishes to feel that his exile is self terminable. And therefore Andrew, telling his story to them in brief, found that they were not by any means filled with unmixed pleasure. Joe Clune, with his bright brown hair of youth and his lined, haggard face of worn middle age, summed up their sentiments at the end of Andrew's story. "You're what we need with us, Lanning. You and Allister will beat the world, and it means high times for the rest of us. But God pity you. That's all." The pause that followed this solemn speech was to Andrew like an amen. He glanced from face to face, and each stern eye met his in gloomy sympathy. Then something shot through him which was to his mind what red is to the eye. It was a searing touch of reckless indifference, defiance. "Forget this prayer meeting talk," said Andrew. "I came up here for action, not mourning. I want something to do with my hands, not something to think about with my head." Something to think about! It was like a terror behind him. If he should have long quiet, it would steal on him and look at him over his shoulder like a face. A little of this showed in his face, enough to make the circle flash significant glances at one another. "You got something behind you, Andy," said Scotty. "Come out with it. It ain't too bad for us to hear." "There's something behind me," said Andrew. "It's the only real decent part of my life, and I don't want to think about it. Allister, they say you never let grass grow under you. What's on your hands now?" "Somebody has been flattering me," said the leader quietly, and all the time he kept studying the face of Andrew. "We have a little game ahead, if you want to come in on it. We're short handed, but I'd try it with you. That makes us 6 all told. 6 enough, boys?" "Count me half of one," said Larry la Roche. "I don't feel lucky about this little party." "We'll count you 2 times 2," replied the leader. He added, "You boys play a game. I'm going to break in Lanning to our job." Taking his horse, he and Andrew rode at a walk up the ravine. On the way the leader explained his system briefly and clearly. Told in short, he worked somewhat as follows. Instead of raiding blindly right and left, he only moved when he had planned every inch of ground for the advance and the blow and the retreat. To make sure of success and the size of his stakes, he was willing to invest heavily. Big business men sink half a year's income in their advertising. I do the same. It was not public advertising. It was money cunningly expended where it would do most good. 50% of the money the gang earned was laid away to make future returns surer. In 20 places Allister had his paid men who, working from behind the scenes, gained priceless information and sent word of it to the outlaw. Trusted officials in great companies were in communication with him. When large shipments of gold were to be made, for instance, he was often warned beforehand. Every dollar of the consignment was known to him, the date of its shipment, its route, and the hands to which it was supposed to fall. Or again, in many a bank and prosperous mercantile firm in the mountain desert, he had inserted his paid spies, who let him know when the safe was crammed with cash and by what means the treasure was guarded. Not until he had secured such information did the leader move, and he still delayed until every possible point of friction had been noted, every danger considered, and a check appointed for it, every method of advance and retreat gone over. A good general, Allister was fond of saying, plans in 2 ways: for an absolute victory and for an absolute defeat. The one enables him to squeeze the last ounce of success out of a triumph. The other keeps a failure from turning into a catastrophe. With everything arranged for the stroke, he usually posted himself with the band as far as possible from the place where the actual work was to be done. Then he made a feint in the opposite direction. He showed himself or a part of his gang recklessly. The moment the alarm was given, even at the risk of having an entire hostile countryside around him, he started a whirlwind course in the opposite direction from which he was generally supposed to be traveling. If possible, at the ranches of adherents or at out of the way places where Confederates could act, he secured fresh horses and dashed on at full speed all the way. Then at the very verge of the place for attack, he gathered his men, rehearsed in detail what each man was to do, delivered the blow, secured the spoils, and each man of the party split away from the others and fled in scattering directions, to assemble again at a distant point on a comparatively distant date. There they sat down around a council table, and there they divided the spoils. No matter how many of them were employed, no matter how vast a proportion of the danger and scheming had been borne by the leader, he took no more than 2 shares. Then 50% of the prize was set aside. The rest was divided with an exact care among the remaining members of the gang. The people who had supplied the requisite information for the coup were always given their share. From this general talk, Allister descended to particulars. He talked of the gang itself. They were quite a fixed quantity. In the last half dozen years there had not been 3 casualties. For one thing, he chose his men with infinite care. In the second place, he saw to it that they remained in harmony, and to that end he was careful never to be tempted into forming an unwieldy crew, no matter how large the prize. Of the present organization, each was an expert. Larry la Roche had been a counterfeiter and was a consummate penman. His forgeries were works of art. Have you noticed his hands? Scotty Macdougal was an eminent advance agent whose smooth tongue was the thing for the very dangerous and extremely important work of trying out new sources of information, noting the dependability of those sources and understanding just how far and in what line the tools could be used. Joe Clune was a past expert in the blowing of safes. Not only did he know everything there was to be known about means of guarding money and how to circumvent them, but he was an artist with the soup, as Allister called nitroglycerin. Jeff Rankin, without a mental equipment to compare with his companions, was often invaluable on account of his prodigious strength. Under the strain of his muscles, iron bars bent like hot wax. In addition, he had had more than his share of ability which all the members of the gang possessed, an infinite cunning in the use of weapons and star-storming courage and self-confidence. "And where," said Andrew at the end of this long recital, "do I fit in?" "You begin," said Allister, "as the least valuable of my men. Before 6 months you will be worth the whole set of them. You start as my lieutenant, Lanning. The boys expect it. You've built up a reputation that counts. They admit your superiority without question. Larry la Roche squirms under the weight of it, but he admits it like the rest of 'em. In a pinch they would obey you nearly as well as they obey me. It means that, having you to take charge, I can do what I've always wanted to do. I can give the main body the slip and go off for advance guard and rear guard duty. I don't dare to do it now. Do you know why? Those fellows yonder, who seem so chummy, would be at each other's throats in 10 seconds if I weren't around to keep them in order. I know why you're here, Lanning. It isn't the money. It's the cursed fear of loneliness and the fear of having time to think. You want action, action to fill your mind and blind you. That's what I offer you. You're the keeper of the 4 wildcats you see over there. You start in with their respect. Let them lose their fear of you for a moment and they'll go for you. Treat them like men, think of them as wild beasts. That's what they are. The minute they know you're without your whip, they go for you like tigers at a wounded trainer. One taste of meat is all they need to madden them. It's different with me. I'm wild too." His eyes gleamed at Andrew. "And if they raise you, I think they'll find you've more iron hidden away in you than I have. But the way they'll find out will be in an explosion that will wipe them out. You've got to handle them without that explosion, Lanning. Can you do it?" The younger man moistened his lips. "I think this job is going to prove worth while," he returned. "Very well, then. But there are penalties in your new position. In a pinch you've got to do what I do, see that they have enough food, go without sleep if one of them needs your blankets. If any of them gets in trouble, even into a jail, you've got to get 'em out." "Better still," smiled Andrew. "And now," said the leader, "I'll tell you about our next job as we go back to the boys." Chapter 35 of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was 10 days later when the band dropped out of the mountains into the Murchison Pass, a singular place for a train robbery, Andrew could not help thinking. They were at the southwestern end of the pass, where the mountains gave back in a broad gap. Below them, not 5 miles away, was the city of Gidding Creek. They could see its buildings and parks tumbled over a big area, for there was a full 25,000 of inhabitants in Gidding Creek. Indeed, the whole country was dotted with villages and towns, for it was no longer a cattle region but a semi-farming district cut up into small tracts. One was almost never out of sight of at least one house. It worried Andrew, this closely built country, and he knew that it worried the other men as well. Yet there had not been a single murmur from among them as they jogged their horses on behind Allister. Each of them was swathed from head to heel in a vast slicker that spread behind, when the wind caught it, as far as the tail of the horse, and the rubber creaked and rustled softly. Whatever they might have been inclined to think of this daring raid into the heart of a comparatively thickly populated country, they were too accustomed to let the leader do their thinking for them to argue the point with him. And Andrew followed blindly enough. He saw, indeed, one strong point in their favor. The very fact that the train was coming out of the heart of the mountains, through ravines which afforded 1,000 places for assault, would make the guards relax their attention as they approached Gidding Creek. And though there were many people in the region, they were a fat and inactive populace, not comparable with the lean fellows of the north. There was bitter work behind them. 10 days before they had made a feint to the north of Martindale that was certain to bring out Hal Dozier. Then they doubled about and had plodded steadily south, choosing always the most desolate ground for their travel. There had been 2 changes of horses for the others, but Andrew kept to Sally. To her that journey was play after the labor she had passed through before. The iron dust of danger and labor was in her even as it was in Andrew. 3 in all that party were fresh at the end of the long trail. They were Allister, Sally, and Andrew. The others were poisoned with weariness, and their tempers were on edge. They kept an ugly silence, and if one of them happened to jostle the horse of the other, there was a flash of teeth and eyes, a silent warning. The 6th man was Scotty, who had long since been detached from the party. His task was one which, if he failed in it, would make all that long ride go for nothing. He was to take the train far up, ride down his blind baggage to the Murchison Pass, and then climb over the tender into the cab, stick up the fireman and the engineer, and make them bring the engine to a halt at the mouth of the pass, with Gidding Creek and safety for all that train only 5 minutes away. There was a touch of the satanic in this that pleased Andrew and made Allister show his teeth in self-appreciation. So perfectly had their journey been timed that the train was due in a very few minutes. They disposed of their horses in the thicket and then went back to take up their position in the ambush. The plan of work was carefully divided. To Jeff Rankin, the nicely accurate shot and bulldog fighter, fell what seemed to be a full half of the total risk and labor. He was to go to the blind side of the job. In other words, he was to guard the opposite side of the train to that on which the main body advanced. It was always possible that when a train was held up, the passengers, at least the unarmed portion, and perhaps even some of the armed men, would break away on the least threatened side. Jeff Rankin, on that blind side, was to turn them back with a hurricane of bullets from his magazine rifle. Firing from ambush and moving from place to place, he would seem more than one man. Probably 3 or 4 shots would turn back the mob. In the meantime, having made the engineer and fireman stop the train, Scotty would be making them continue to flood the firebox. This would delay the start of the engine on its way and gain precious moments for the fugitives. 2 of the band would be thus employed while Larry LaRoche went through the train and turned out the passengers. There was no one like Larry for facing a crowd and cowing it. His spectral form, his eyes burning through the holes in his mask, stripped them of any idea of resistance. While the crowd turned out, Andrew, standing opposite the middle of the train, rifle in hand, would line them up, while Allister and Joe Clune attended to overpowering the guards of the safe, and Larry LaRoche came out and went through the line of passengers for personal valuables, and Clune and Allister fixed the soup to blow the safe. Last of all, there was the explosion, the carrying off of the coin in its canvas sacks to the horses. Each man was to turn his horse in a direction carefully specified, and riding in a roundabout manner, which was also named, he was to keep on until he came, 5 days later, to a deserted, ruinous shack far up in the mountains on the side of the Twin Eagles peaks. These were the instructions which Allister went over carefully with each member of his crew before they went to their posts. There had been 20 rehearsals before, and each man was letter perfect. They took their posts, and Allister came to the side of Andrew among the trees. "How are you?" he asked. "Scared to death," said Andrew truthfully. "I'd give $1,000 if I had it to be free of this job." Andrew saw the hard glint come in the eyes of the leader. "You'll do later," nodded Allister. "But keep back from the crowd. Don't let them see you get nervous when they turn out of the coaches. If you show a sign of wavering, they might start something. Once they make a surge, shooting won't stop 'em." Andrew nodded. There was more practical advice on the heels of this. Then they stood quietly and waited. For days and days a northeaster had been blowing. It had whipped little drifts of rain and mist that stung the face and sent chill to the bone, and though there had been no actual downpour, the cold and the wet had never broken since the journey started. Now the wind came like a wolf down the Murchison Pass, howling and moaning. Andrew, closing his eyes, felt that the whole thing was dreamlike. Presently he would open his eyes and find himself back beside the fire in the house of Uncle Jasper, with the old man prodding his shoulder and telling him that it was bedtime. When he opened his eyes, in fact, they fell upon a solitary pine high up on the opposite slope, above the thicket where Jeff Rankin was hiding. It was a sickly tree, half naked of branches, and it shivered like a wretched animal in the wind. Then a new sound came down the pass, wolf-like indeed. It was repeated more clearly, the whistle of a train. It was the signal arranged among them for putting on the masks, and Andrew hastily adjusted his. "Did you hear that?" asked Allister as the train hooted in the distance again. Andrew turned and started at the ghostly thing which had been the face of the outlaw a moment before. He himself Must look like that, he knew. "What?" he asked. "That voice like whistle," said Allister. "There's no luck in this day for me." "You've listened to Larry la Roche too much," said Andrew. "He's been growling ever since we started on this trail." "No, no," returned Allister. "It's another thing, an older thing than Larry la Roche. My mother—" He stopped. Whatever it was he was about to say, Andrew was never to hear it. The train had turned the long bend above, and now the roar of its wheels filled the canyon and covered the sound of the wind. It looked vast as a mountain as it came, rocking perceptibly on the uneven road bed. It rounded the curve, the tail of the train flicked around, and it shot at full speed straight for the mouth of the pass. How could one man stop it? How could 5 men attack it after it was stopped? It was like trying to storm a medieval fortress with a pop gun. The great black front of the engine came rocking toward them, gathering impetus on the sharp grade. Had Scotty missed his trick? But when the thunder of the iron on iron was deafening Andrew, and the engine seemed almost upon them, there was a cloud of white vapor that burst out on either side of it, and the brakes were jumped on. The wheels skidded screaming on the tracks. The engine lurched past. Andrew caught a glimpse of Scotty, a crouched, masked form in the cab of the engine, with a gun in either hand. For Scotty was one of the few natural two-gun men that Andrew was ever to know. The engineer and the fireman he saw only as two shades before they were whisked out of his view. The train rumbled on. Then it went from half speed to a stop with one jerk that brought a cry from the coaches. During the next second there was the successive crashing of couplings as the coaches took up their slack. Andrew, stepping out with his rifle balanced in his hands, saw Larry la Roche whip into the rear car. Then he himself swept the windows of the train, blurred by the mist, with the muzzle of his gun, keeping the butt close to his shoulder, ready for a swift snapshot in any direction. In fact, his was that very important post, the reserve force, which was to come instantly to the aid of any overpowered section of the active workers. He had rebelled against this minor task, but Allister had assured him that, in former times, it was the place which he took himself to meet crises in the attack. The leader had gone with Joe Clune straight for the front car. How would they storm it? 2 guards armed to the teeth would be in it, and the door was closed. But the guards had no intention to remain like rats in a trap while the rest of the train was overpowered, and they themselves were blasted into small bits with a small charge of soup. The door jerked open. The barrels of 2 guns protruded. Andrew, thrilling with horror, recognized one as a sawed-off shotgun. He saw now the meaning of the manner in which Allister and Clune had made their attack. For Allister had run slowly straight for the door, while Clune skirted in close to the cars, going more swiftly. As the gun barrels went up, Allister plunged headlong to the ground, and the volley of shots missed him cleanly. But Clune, the next moment, leaped out from the side of the car, and thereby getting himself to an angle from which he could deliver a crossfire, pumped 2 bullets through the door. Andrew saw a figure throw up its arms, a shadow form in the interior of the car, and then a man pitched out headlong through the doorway and flopped with horrible limpness on the roadbed. While this went on, Allister had snapped a shot while he lay prone, and his single bullet brought a scream. The guards were done for. 2 deaths, Andrew supposed, but presently a man was sent out of the car at the point of Clune's revolver. He climbed down with difficulty, clutching one hand with the other. He had been shot in the most painful place in the body, the palm of the hand. Allister turned over the other form with a brutal carelessness that sickened Andrew. But the man had only been stunned by a bullet that plowed its way across the top of his skull. He sat up now with a trickle running down his face. A gesture from Andrew's rifle made him and his companion realize that they were covered, and without attempting any further resistance they sat side by side on the ground and tended to each other's wounds, a ludicrous group for all their suffering. In the meantime Clune and Allister were at work in the car. The water was hissing in the fire box as a vast cloud of steam came rushing out around the engine. The passengers were pouring out of the cars. They acted like a group of actors, carefully rehearsed for the piece. Not once did Andrew have to speak to them, while they ranged in a solid line, shoulder to shoulder, men, women, children. And then Larry la Roche went down the line with a saddlebag and took up the collection. "Passing the hat so often has given me a religious touch, ladies and gents," Andrew heard the ruffians say. "Any little contributions I'm sure grateful for, and if anything's held back I'm apt to frisk the gent that don't fork over. Hey, you, what's that lump inside your coat? Lady, don't lie, I seen you drop it inside your dress. Why, it's a nice little set of sparklers. That ain't nothing to be ashamed of. Come on, please, a little more speed. Easy there, partner. Don't take both of them hands down at once. You can peel the stuff out of your pockets with one hand, I figure. Conductor, just let me see your wallet. Thanks. Hate to bother you, ma'am, but you sure ain't traveling on this train with only 85 cents in your pocketbook. Just let me have a look at the rest. See if you can't find it in your stocking. No, there ain't anything here to make you blush. You're among friends, lady, a plumb friendly crowd. Your poor old pa give you this to go to school on, did he? Son, you're getting a pile more education out of this than you would in college. No, honey, you just keep your locket. It ain't worth $5. Did you? That jeweler ought to have my job, 'cause he sure robbed you. You call that watch an heirloom? Heirloom is my middle name, miss. Just get them danglers out of your ears, lady. Thanks. Don't hurry, mister. You'll bust the chain." His monologue was endless. He had a comment for every person in the line, and he seemed to have a seventh sense for concealed articles. The saddlebag was bulging before he was through. At the same time Allister and Clune jumped from the car and ran. Larry la Roche gave the warning. Everyone crouched or lay down. The soup exploded. The top of the car lifted. It made Andrew think, foolishly enough, of someone tipping a hat. It fell slowly with a crash that was like a faint echo of the explosion. Clune ran back, and they could hear his shrill yell of delight. "It ain't a safe," he exclaimed. "It's a baby mint." A baby mint it was. It was a gold shipment. Gold coins run about 90 pounds to $10,000, and there was close to 100 pounds apiece for each of the bandits. It was the largest haul Allister's gang had ever made. Larry la Roche left the pilfering of the passengers and went to help carry the loot. They brought it out in little loose canvas bags and went on the run with it to the horses. Someone was speaking. It was the gray-headed man with the glasses and the kindly look about the eyes. "Boys, this is the worst little game you've ever worked. I promise you we'll keep on your trail until we've run you all into the ground. That's really something to remember. I speak for Gregg and Sons." "Partner," said Scotty McDougal from the cab, where he still kept the engineer and fireman covered, "a little hunt is like an after-dinner drink to me." To the utter amazement of Andrew, the crowd which had just been carefully and systematically robbed, burst into laughter. But this was the end. There was Allister's whistle. Jeff Rankin ran around from the other side of the train. The gang faded instantly into the thicket. Andrew, as the rear guard, his most ticklish moment, backed slowly toward the trees. Once there was a waver in the line, such as precedes a rush. He stopped short, and a single twitch of his rifle froze the waverers in their tracks. Once inside the thicket, a yell came from the crowd, but Andrew had whirled and was running at full speed. He could hear the others crashing away. Sally, as he had taught her, broke into a trot as he approached, and the moment he struck the saddle she was in full gallop. Guns were rattling behind him. Random shots cut the air, sometimes close to him, but not one of the whole crowd dared venture beyond that unknown screen of trees. End of chapter 35. of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. To Andrew, the last danger of the holdup had been assigned as the rear guard, and he was the last man to pass Allister. The leader had drawn his horse to one side a couple of miles down the valley, and as each of his band passed him, he raised his hand in silent greeting. It was the last Andrew saw of him, a ghostly figure, sitting his horse with his hand above his head. After that, his mind was busied by his ride, for having the finest mount in the crowd, to him had been assigned the longest and the most roundabout route to reach the Twin Eagles. Yet he covered so much ground with Sally that instead of needing the full 5 days to make the rendezvous, he could afford to loaf the last stage of the journey. Even at that, he camped in sight of the cabin on the 4th night, and on the morning of the 5th he was the first man at the shack. Jeff Rankin came in next. To Jeff, on account of his unwieldy bulk, had been assigned the shortest route. Yet even so, he dismounted, staggering and limping from his horse, and collapsed on the pile of boughs which Andrew had spent the morning cutting for a bed. As he dropped, he tossed his bag of coins to the floor. It fell with a melodious jingling that was immediately drowned by Jeff's groans. The saddle was torture to him, and now he was aching in every joint of his enormous body. "A nice haul, nothing to kick about," was Jeff's opinion. "But Caesar's ghost, what a ride! The chief makes this thing too hard on a gent that likes to go easy, Andy." Andrew said nothing. Silence had been his cue ever since he began acting as lieutenant to the chief. It had seemed to baffle the others. It baffled the big man now. Later on, Joe Clune and Scotty came in together. That was about noon. They had met each other an hour before. But Allister had not come in, although he was usually the first at a rendezvous. Neither did Larry la Roche come. The day wore on. The silence grew on the group. When Andrew, proportioning the work for supper, sent Joe to get wood, Jeff for water, and began himself to work with Scotty on the cooking, he was met with ugly looks and hesitation before they obeyed. Something, he felt most decidedly, was in the air. And when Joe and Rankin came back slowly, walking side by side and talking in soft voices, his suspicions were given an edge. They wanted to eat together, but he forced Scotty to take post on the high hill to their right to keep lookout, and for this he received another scowl. Then, when supper was half over, Larry la Roche came into camp. News came with him, an atmosphere of tidings around his gloomy figure, but he cast himself down by the fire and ate and drank in silence until his hunger was gone. Then he tossed his tin dishes away, and they fell clattering on the rocks. "Pick 'em up," said Andrew quietly. "We'll have no litter around this camp." Larry la Roche stared at him in hushed malevolence. "Stand up and get 'em," repeated Andrew. As he saw the big hands of Larry twitching, he smiled across the fire at the tall, bony figure. "I'll give you 2 seconds to get 'em," he said. One deadly second pulsed away. Then Larry crumpled. He caught up his tin cup and the plate. "We'll talk later about you," he said ominously. "We'll talk about something else first," said Andrew. "You seen Allister?" At first it seemed that La Roche would not speak. Then his wide, thin lips writhed back from his teeth. "Yes." "Where is he?" "Gone to the happy hunting grounds." The silence came and the pulse in it. One by natural instinct, the men looked about them sharply into the night and made sure of their weapons. It was the only tribute to the memory of Allister from his men, but tears and praise could not have been more eloquent. He had made these men fearless of the whole world. Now they were ready to jump at the passage of a shadow. They looked at each other with strange eyes. "Who? How many?" asked Jeff Rankin. "One man done it." "Hal Dozier?" said Andrew. "Him," said Larry la Roche. He went on, looking gloomily down at the fire. "He got me first. The chief must have seen him get me by surprise while I was down off my horse, lying flat and drinking out of a creek." He closed his great bony fist in unspeakable agony at the thought. "Dozier come behind and took me, frisked me, took my guns, not the coin. We went down through the hills. Then the chief slid out of a shadow and come at us like a tiger. I sloped." "You left Allister to fight alone?" said Scotty Macdougal quietly, for he had come from his lookout to listen. "I had no gun," said Larry, without raising his eyes from the fire. "I sloped. I looked back and seen Allister sitting on his horse, dead still. Hal Dozier was sitting on his horse, dead still. 5 seconds, maybe. Then they went for their guns together. They was two bangs like one. But Allister slid out of his saddle and Dozier stayed in his. I come on here." The quiet covered them. Joe Clune, with a shudder and another glance over his shoulder, cast a branch on the fire and the flames leaped. "Dozier knows you're with us," added Larry la Roche, and he cast a long glance of hatred at Andrew. "He knows you're with us, and he knows our luck left us when you come." Andrew looked about the circle. Not an eye met his. The talk of Larry la Roche during the days of the ride was showing its effect now. The gauge had been thrown down to Andrew, and he dared not pick it up. "Boys," he said, "I'll say this. Are we going to bust up and each man go his way?" There was no answer. "If we do, we can split the profits over again. I'll take no money out of a thing that cost Allister's death. There's my sack on the floor of the shack. Divvy it up among you. You fitted me out when I was broke. That'll pay you back. Do we split up?" "They's no reason why we should, and be run down like rabbits?" said Joe Clune, with another of those terrible glances over his shoulder into the night. The others assented with so many growls. "All right," said Andrew, "we stick together, and if we stick together, I run this camp." "You?" asked Larry la Roche. "Who picked you? Who 'lected you, son? Why, you're unlucky." "Ease up," said Andrew softly. The eyes of la Roche flicked across the circle and picked up the glances of the others, but they were not yet ready to tackle Andrew Lanning. "The last thing Allister did," said Andrew, "was to make me his lieutenant. It's the last thing he did, and I'm going to push it through. Not because I like the job." He raised his head, but not his voice. "They may run down the rest of you. They won't run down me. They can't. They've tried, and they can't. I might be able to keep the rest of you clear. I'm going to try, but I won't follow the lead of any of you. If there'd been one that could keep the rest of you together, do you think Allister wouldn't have seen it? Don't you think he would have made that one leader? Why, look at you, Jeff. You follow Clune, but would Larry and Scotty follow Clune? Look at 'em and see." All eyes went to Clune, and then the glances of Scotty and la Roche dropped. "Nobody here would follow la Roche. He's the best man we've got for some of the hardest work, but you're too flighty with your temper, Larry, and you know it. We respect you just as much, but not to plan things for the rest of us. Isn't that straight?" "And you, Scotty," said Andrew. "You're the only one I'd follow. I say that freely. But who else would follow you? You're the best of us all at head work and planning, but you don't swing your gun as fast, and you don't shoot as straight as Jeff or Larry or Joe. Isn't that straight?" "What's leading the gang got to do with fighting?" asked Scotty harshly. "And who's got the right to the head of things but me?" "Ask Allister what fighting had to do with the running of things," said Andrew calmly. The moon was sliding up out of the east. It changed the faces of the men and made them oddly animal like. They stared fascinated at Andrew. "There's two reasons why I'm going to run this job if we stick together." Allister named them once. "I can take advice from any one of you. I know what each of you can do. I can plan a job for you. I can lead you clear of the law, and there's not one of you that can bully me or make me give an inch. No, nor all of you together, La Roche, MacDougal, Clune, Rankin." It was like a roll call, and at each name a head was jerked up in answer, and two glittering eyes flashed at Andrew, flashed, sparkled, and then became dull. The moonlight had made his pale skin a deadly white, and it was a demoniac face they saw. The silence was his answer. "Jeff," he commanded, "take the hill. You'll stand the watch tonight. And look sharp. If Dozier got Allister, he's apt to come at us. Step on it." And Jeff Rankin rose without a word and lumbered to the top of the hill. Larry La Roche suddenly filled his cup with boiling hot coffee, regardless of the heat, regardless of the dirt in the cup. His hand shook when he raised it to his lips. End of chapter 36. Of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was no further attempt at challenging his authority. When he ordered Clune and La Roche to bring in boughs for bedding, since they were to stop in the shack overnight, they went silently. But it was such a silence as comes when the wind falls at the end of the day, and in a silent sky the clouds pile heavily higher and higher. Andrew took the opportunity to speak to Scotty MacDougal. He told Scotty simply that he needed him, and with him at his back he could handle the others, and more too. He was surprised to see a twinkle in the eye of the Scotchman. "Why, Andy," said the canny fellow, "didn't you see me pass you the wink? I was with you all the time." Andrew thanked him and went into the cabin to arrange for lights. He had no intention of shirking a share of the actual work of the camp, even though Allister had set that example for his following. He took some lengths of pitchy pine sticks and arranged them for torches. One of them alone would send a flare of yellow light through the cabin. Two made a comfortable illumination. But he worked cheerlessly. The excitement of the robbery and the chase was over, and then the conflict with the men was passing. He began to see things truly by the drab light of retrospection. The bullets of Allister and Clune might have gone home. They were intended to kill, not to wound. And if there had been two deaths, he, Andrew Lanning, would have been equally guilty with the men who handled the guns, for he had been one of the forces which made that shooting possible. It was an ugly way to look at it, very ugly. It kept a frown on Andrew's face while he arranged the torches in the main room of the shack, and then put one for future reference in the little shed which leaned against the rear of the main structure. He arranged his own bed in this second room, where the saddles and other accoutrements were piled. It was easily explained, since there was hardly room for 5 men in the first room. But he had another purpose. He wanted to separate himself from the others, just as Allister always did. Even in a crowded room, Allister would seem aloof, and Andrew determined to make the famous leader his guide. Above all, he was troubled by what Scotty had said. He would have felt easy at heart if the Scotchman had met him with an argument, or with a frown of honest opposition, or with a hearty handshake to say that all was well between them. But this cunning lie, this cunning protestation that he had been with the new leader from the first, put Andrew on his guard, for he knew perfectly well that Scotty had not been on his side during the crisis with La Roche. MacDougal sat before the door, his metal flask of whiskey beside him. It was a fault of Allister, this permitting of whiskey at all times and in all places after a job was finished. And while it made the other men savage beasts, it turned Scotty MacDougal into a wily, smiling snake. He had bit the heel of more than one man in his drinking bouts. Presently La Roche and Clune came in. They had been talking together again. Andrew could tell by the manner in which they separated as soon as they entered the room, and by their voices, which they made loud and cheerful, and also by the fact that they avoided looking at each other. They were striving patently to prove that there was nothing between them, and if Andrew had been on guard, now he became tingling so. They arranged their bunks. Larry La Roche took from his vest a pipe with a small bowl and a long stem, and sat down cross-legged to smoke. Andrew suggested that Larry produce the contents of his saddlebag and share the spoils of war. He brought it out willingly enough and spilled it out on the improvised table, a glittering mass of gold trinkets, watches, jewels. He picked out of the mass a chain of diamonds and spread it out on his snaky fingers so that the light could play on it. Andrew knew nothing about gems, but he knew that that chain must be worth a great deal of money. "This," said Larry, "is my share. You gents can have the rest and split it up." "A nice set of sparklers," nodded Clune, "but there's plenty left to satisfy me." "What you think," declared Scotty, "ain't of any importance, Joe. It's what the chief thinks that counts. Is it square, Lanning?" Andrew flushed at the appeal and the ugly looks which La Roche and Clune cast toward him. He could have stifled Scotty for that appeal, and yet Scotty was smiling in the greatest apparent good nature and belief in their leader. His face was flushed, but his lips were bloodless. Alcohol always affected him in that manner. "I don't know the value of the stones," said Andrew. "Don't you?" murmured Scotty. "I forgot. Thought maybe you would." That was something that Allister did know. The new leader saw a flash of glances toward Scotty, but the latter continued to eye the captain with a steady and innocent look. "Scotty," decided Andrew instantly, "is my chief enemy." If he could detach one man to his side all would be well. 2 against 3 would be a simple thing as long as he was one of the 2. But 4 against 1, and such a 4 as these, was hopeless odds. There seemed little chance of getting Joe Clune. There remained only Jeff Rankin as his possible ally, and already he had stepped on Jeff's toes sorely by making the tired giant stand guard. He thought of all these things, of course, in a flash. And then, in an answer to his thoughts, Jeff Rankin appeared. His heavy footfall crashed inside the door. He stopped, panting, and in spite of his news, paused to blink at the flash of jewels. "It's coming," said Jeff. "Boys, get your guns and scatter out of the cabin. Duck that light. Hal Dozier is coming up the valley." There was not a single exclamation, but the lights went out as if by magic. There were a couple of light, hissing sounds such as iron makes when it is whipped swiftly across leather. "How'd you know him by this light?" asked Larry La Roche as they went out of the door. Outside they found everything brilliant with the white moonshine of the mountains. "Nobody but Hal Dozier rides twisted that way in the saddle. I'd tell him in 1,000. It's old wounds that makes him ride like that. We've got 10 minutes. He's taken the long way up the canyon, and there ain't anybody with him." "If he's come alone," said Andrew, "he's come for me and not for the rest of you." No one spoke. Then Larry La Roche: "He wants to make it man to man. That's clear. That's why he pulled up his horse and waited for Allister to make the first move for his gun. It's a clean challenge to some one of us." Andrew saw his chance and used it mercilessly. "Which one of you is willing to take the challenge?" he asked. "Which one of you is willing to ride down the canyon and meet him alone? La Roche, I've heard you curse Dozier." But Larry la Roche answered: "What's this fool talking about taking a challenge? I say string out behind the hills and pot 'em with rifles." "One man and we're five," said Jeff Rankin. "It ain't sporting, Larry. I hate to hear you say that. We'd be despised all over the mountains if we done it. He's making his play with a lone hand, and we've got to meet him the same way, eh, Chief?" It was sweet to Andrew to hear that appeal, and he saw them turn one by one toward him in the moonlight and wait. It was his first great tribute. He looked over those four wolfish figures and felt his heart swelling. "Wish me luck, boys," he said, and without another word he turned and went down the hillside. The others watched him with amazement. He felt it rather than saw it, and it kept a tingle in his blood. He felt also that they were spreading out to either side to get a clear view of the fight that was to follow, and it occurred to him that, even if Hal Dozier killed him, there would not be one chance in 1,000 of Hal's getting away. 4 deadly rifles would be covering him. It must be that a sort of madness had come on Dozier, advancing in this manner, unsupported by a posse. Or perhaps he had no idea that the outlaws could be so close. He expected a daylight encounter high up the mountains. But Andrew went swiftly down the ravine. Broken cliffs, granite boulders jumped up on either side of him, and the rocks were pale and glimmering under the moon. This one valley seemed to receive the light. The loftier mountains rolling away on each side were black as jet, with sharp, ragged outlines against the sky. It was a cold light, and the chill of it went through Andrew. He was afraid as he had been when Buck Heath faced him in Martindale, or when Bill Dozier ran him down, or when the famous Sandy cornered him. His fingers felt brittle, and his breath came and went in short gasps, drawn into the upper part of his lungs only. Behind him, like an electric force pushing him on, the outlaws watched his steps. They also were shuddering with fear, and he knew it. Dozier was coming, fresh from another kill. "Only one man I'd think twice about meeting," Allister had said in the old days, and he had been right. Yet there were thousands who had sworn that Allister was invincible, that he would never fall before a single man. He thought, too, of the lean face and the peculiar, set eye of Dozier. The man had no fear. He had no nerves. He was a machine, and death was his business. And was he, Andrew Lanning, unknown until the past few months, now going down to face destruction, as full of fear as a girl trembling at the dark? What was it that drew them together, so unfairly matched? He could still see only the white haze of the moonshine before him, but now there was a clicking of hoofs on the rock. Dozier was coming. Andrew walked squarely out into the middle of the ravine and waited. He had set his teeth. The nerves on the bottom of his feet were twitching. Something freezing cold was beginning at the tips of his fingers. How long would it take Dozier to come? An interminable time. The hoof beats actually seemed to fade out and draw away at one time. Then they began again very near him, and now they stopped. Had Dozier seen him around the elbow curve? That heartbreaking instant passed, and the clicking began again. Then the rider came slowly in view. First there was the nodding head of the cowpony, then the foot in the stirrup, then Hal Dozier riding a little twisted in the saddle, a famous characteristic of his. He came on closer and closer. He began to seem huge on the horse. Was he blind not to see the figure that waited for him? A voice that was not his, that he did not recognize, leaped out from between his teeth and tore at his throat. "Dozier!" The cowpony halted with a start. The rider jerked straight in his saddle. The echo of the call barked back from some angling cliff face down the ravine. All that before Dozier made his move. He had dropped the reins, and Andrew, with a mad intention of proving that himself did not make the first move toward his weapon, had folded his arms. He did not move through the freezing instant that followed. Not until there was a convulsive jerk of Dozier's elbow did he stir his folded arms. Then his right arm loosened, and the hand flashed down to his holster. Was Dozier moving with clogged slowness, or was it that he had ceased to be a body, that he was all brain and hair trigger nerves, making every thousandth part of a second seem a unit of time? It seemed to Andrew that the marshal's hand dragged through its work. To those who watched from the sides of the ravine, there was a flash of fire from his gun before they even saw the flash of steel out of the holster. The gun spat in the hand of Dozier, and something jerked at the shirt of Andrew beside his neck. He himself had fired only once, and he knew that the shot had been too high and to the right of his central target. Yet he did not fire again. Something strange was happening to Hal Dozier. His head had nodded forward as though in mockery of the bullet. His extended right hand fell slowly, slowly. His whole body began to sway and lean toward the right. Not until that moment did Andrew know that he had shot the marshal through the body. He raced to the side of the cattle pony, and as the horse veered away, Hal Dozier dropped limply into his arms. He lay with his limbs sprawling at odd angles beside him. His muscles seemed paralyzed, but his eyes were bright and wide, and his face perfectly composed. "There's luck for you," said Hal Dozier calmly. "I pulled it 2 inches to the right, or I would have broken your neck with the slug. Anyway, I spoiled your shirt." The cold was gone from Andrew, and he felt his heart thundering and shaking his body. He was repeating like a frightened child, "For God's sake, Hal, don't die, don't die." The paralyzed body did not move, but the calm voice answered him: "You fool, finish me before your gang comes and does it for you." End of chapter 37. Of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was a rush of footsteps behind and around him, a jangle of voices, and there were 4 huddled over Hal Dozier. Andrew had risen and stepped back, silently thanking God that it was not a death. He heard the voices of the 4 like voices in a dream. "A clean one. A nice bit of work. Dozier, are you thinking of Allister, curse you? Do you remember Hugh Wiley now? Don't you maybe recollect my pal Bud Swain? Think about him, Dozier, while you're dying." The calm eyes traveled without hurry from face to face, and curiosity came to Andrew, a cool, deadly curiosity. He stepped among the gang. "He's not fatally hurt," he said. "What do you intend to do with him?" "You're all wrong, Chief," said Larry la Roche, and he grinned at Andrew. His submission now was perfect and complete. There was even a sort of worship in the bright eyes that looked at the new leader. "I hate to say it, but right as you most generally are, you're wrong this time. He's done. He don't need no more looking to. Leave him be for an hour and he'll be finished. Also, that'll give him a chance to think. He needs a chance. Old Curly had a chance to think. Took him 4 hours to kick out after Dozier plugged him. I heard what he had to say, and it wasn't pretty. I think maybe it'd be sort of interesting to hear what Dozier has to say, 'long about the time he gets thirsty. Eh, boys?" There was a snarl from the other 3 as they looked down at the wounded man, who did not speak a word. Andrew knew that he was indeed alone with that crew, for the man who he had just shot down was nearer to him than the members of Allister's gang. He spoke suddenly: "Jeff, take his head. Clune, take his feet. Carry him up to the cabin." They only stared at him. "Look here, Captain," said Scotty in a soft voice just a trifle thickened by whiskey, "are you thinking of taking him up there and tying him up so that he'll live through this?" and again the other three snarled softly. "You murdering hounds," said Andrew. That was all. They looked at each other. They looked at the new leader, and the sight of his white face and his nervous right hand was too much for them. They took up the marshal and carried him to the cabin, his pony following like a dog behind. They brought him, without asking for directions, straight into the little rear room, Andrew's room. It was a sufficiently intelligible way of saying that this was his work and none of theirs. And not a hand lifted to aid him while he went to work with the bandaging. He knew little about such work, but the marshal himself, in a rather faint but perfectly steady voice, gave directions. And in the painful cleaning of the wound he did not murmur once. Neither did he express the slightest gratitude. He kept following Andrew about the room with coldly curious eyes. In the next room the voices of the four were a steady rumbling murmur. Now and then the glance of the marshal wandered to the door. When the bandaging was complete he asked, "Do you know you've started a job you can't finish?" "Ah," murmured Andrew. "Those four," said the marshal, "won't let you." Andrew smiled. "Are you easier now?" "Don't bother about me. I'll tell you what, I wish you'd get me a drink of water." "I'll send one of the boys." "No, get it yourself. I want to say something to them while you're gone." Andrew had risen from his knees. He now studied the face of the marshal steadily. "You want 'em to come here and drill you, eh?" he said. "Why?" The other nodded. "I've given up hope once. I've gone through the hardest part of dying. Let them finish the job now." "Tomorrow you'll feel differently." "Will I?" asked the marshal. All at once his eyes went yellow with hate. "I go back to the desert. I go to Martindale. People I pass on the street whisper as I go by. They tell over and over how I went down, and a kid did it, a raw kid." He closed his eyes in silent agony. Then he looked up more keenly than before. "Hal, they'll know that it was luck that my gun stuck in the holster and that you jumped me on the draw." "You lie," said Andrew calmly. "Your gun came out as clean as a whistle, and I waited for you, Dozier. You know I did." The pain in the marshal's face became a ghastly thing to see. At last he could speak. "A sneak always lies well," he replied as he sneered at Lanning. He went on while Andrew sat shivering with passion. "And any fool can get in a lucky shot now and then. But when I'm out of this I'll hunt you down again and I'll plant you full of lead, my son. You can lay to that." The hard breathing of Andrew gradually subsided. "It won't work, Dozier," he said quietly. "You can't make me mad enough to shoot a man who's down. You can't make me murder you." The marshal closed his eyes again while his breathing was beginning to grow fainter, and there was an unpleasant rattle in the hollow of his throat. Andrew went into the next room. "Scotty," he said, "will you let me have your flask?" Scotty smiled at him. "Not for what you'd use it for, Lanning," he said. Andrew picked up a cup and shoved it across the table. "Pour a little whiskey in that, please," he said. Scotty looked up and studied him. Then he tipped his flask and poured a thin stream into the cup until it was half full. Andrew went back towards the door, the cup in his left hand. He backed up, keeping his face steadily toward the four, and kicked open the door behind him. War, he knew, had been declared. Then he raised the marshal's head and gave him a sip of the fiery stuff. It cleared the face of the wounded man. Then Andrew rolled down his blankets before the door, braced a small stick against it so that the sound would be sure to wake him if anyone tried to enter, and laid down for the night. He was almost asleep when the marshal said: "Are you really going to stick it out, Andy?" "Yes." "In spite of what I said?" "I suppose you meant it all. You'd hunt me down and kill me like a dog after you get back on your feet." Like a dog. If you think it over and see things clearly, replied Andrew, you'll see that what I've done for my own sake and not for yours. How do you make that out, with 4 men in the next room ready to stick a knife in your back, if I know anything about 'em? I'll tell you. I owe nothing to you, but a man owes a lot to himself, and I'm going to pay myself in full. End of chapter 38. Of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but though he came to the verge of oblivion, the voices from the other room finally waked him. They had been changing subtly during the past hours, and now they rose, and there was a ring to them that troubled Andrew. He could make out their talk part of the time, and then again they lowered their voices to rumbling growls. At such times he knew that they were speaking of him, and the hum of the undertone was more ominous than open threats. When they talked aloud there was a confused clamor. When they were more hushed there was always the oily murmur of Scotty's voice taking the lead and directing the current of the talk. The liquor was going the rounds fast now. Before they left for the Murchison Pass they had laid in a comfortable supply, but apparently Allister had cached a quantity of the stuff at the Twin Eagles shack. Of one thing Andrew was certain, that 4 such practiced whiskey drinkers would not let their party degenerate into a drunken rout, and another thing was even more sure, that Scotty Macdougal would keep his head better than the best of the others. But what the alcohol would do would be to cut the leash of constraint and dig up every strong passion among them. For instance, Jeff Rankin was by far the most equable of the lot, but given a little whiskey, Jeff became a conscienceless devil. He knew his own weakness, and Andrew, crawling to the door, was putting his ear to the crack under it. He found that the sounds of the voices became instantly clearer. The others were plying Jeff with the liquor, and Jeff, knowing that he had had enough, was persistently refusing, but with less and less energy. There must be a very definite reason for this urging of Rankin toward the whiskey, and Andrew was not hard pressed to find out that reason. The big, rather good-natured giant was leaning toward the side of the new leader just as steadily as the others were leaning away from him. Whiskey alone would stop his scruples. Larry la Roche, his voice a guarded, hissing whisper, was speaking to Jeff as Andrew began listening from his new position. "What I ask you," said La Roche, "is this. Have we had any luck since the kid joined us?" "We've got a pile of coin," said Jeff obstinately. "Do you stack a little coin against the loss of Allister?" asked Larry la Roche. "Easy," cautioned Scotty. "Not so loud, Larry." "He's asleep," said Larry la Roche. "I heard him lie down after he put something agin the door. No fear of him." "Don't be so sure. He might make a noise lying down and make not a sound getting up. And even when he's asleep he's got one eye open like a wolf." "Well," repeated Larry insistently, and now his voice was so faint that Andrew had to guess at half the syllables. "Answer my question, Jeff. Have we had good luck or bad luck, taking it all in all, since he joined us?" "How do I know it's his fault?" asked Jeff. "We all knew it would be a close pinch if Allister ever jumped Hal Dozier. We thought Allister was a little bit faster than Dozier. Everybody else said that Dozier was the best man that ever pulled a gun out of leather. It wasn't luck that beat Allister. It was a better man." There was a thud as his fist hit the rickety, squeaking table in the center of the room. "I say, let's play fair and square. How do I know that the kid Won't make a good leader." Scotty broke in smoothly. "Makes me grin when you say that, Jeff. Tell you what the trouble is with you, old man. You're too modest. A fellow that's done what you've done, following a kid that ain't 25." There was a bear-like grunt from Jeff. He was not altogether displeased by this gracious tribute. But he answered: "You're too slippery with your tongue, Scotty. I never know when you mean what you say." It must have been a bitter pill for Scotty to swallow, but he was not particularly formidable with his weapons, compared with straight-eyed Jeff Rankin, and he answered: "Maybe there's some I jolly along a bit, but when I talk to old Jeff Rankin, I talk straight. Look at me now, Jeff. Do I look as if I was joking with you?" "I ain't any hand at reading minds," grumbled Jeff. He added suddenly: "I say, it was the finest thing I ever see, the way young Lanning stood out there in the valley. Did you watch? Did you see him let Dozier get the jump on his gun? Pretty, pretty, pretty. And then his own gat was out like a flash. One wink, and there was Hal Dozier drilled clean. I tell you, boys, you got this young Lanning wrong. I sort of cottoned to the kid. I always did. I liked him the first time I ever laid eyes on him. So did you all, except Larry yonder. And it was Larry that turned you agin him after he come and joined us. Who asked him to join us? We did." "Who asked him to be captain?" said Scotty. It seemed to stagger Jeff Rankin. "Allister used him for a sort of second man. Seems like he meant him to lead us in case anything happened to him." "While Allister was living," said Scotty, "you know I would have followed him anywhere. Wasn't I his advance agent? Didn't I do his planning with him? But now Allister's dead, worse luck, but dead he is." He paused here cunningly, and no doubt during that pause each of the outlaws conjured up a picture of the scar-faced man with the bright, steady eyes, who had led them so long and quelled them so often and held them together through thick and thin. "Allister's dead," repeated Scotty, "and what he did while he was alive don't hold us now. We chose him for captain out of our own free will. Now that he's dead, we have the right to elect another captain. What's Lanning done that he has a right to fill Allister's place with us? What job did he have at the hold-up? When we stuck up the train, didn't he have the easiest job? Did he give one good piece of advice while we were planning the job? Did he show any ability to lead us then?" The answer came unhesitatingly from Rankin. "It wasn't his place to lead while Allister was with us. And I'll tell you what he's done after Allister died. When I seen Dozier coming, who was it that stepped out to meet him? Was it you, Scotty? No, it wasn't. It wasn't you, LaRoche, neither. Nor you, Clune. It wasn't me. Made me sick inside the thought of facing Dozier. Why? Because I knew he'd never been beat. Because I knew he was a better man than Allister, and that Allister had been a better man than me. And it ain't no bragging to say I'm a handier gent with my guns than any of you. Well, I was sick, and you all were sick. I seen your faces, but who steps out and takes the lead? It was the kid you grin at, Scotty. It was Andy Lanning, and I say it was a fine thing to do. It was undoubtedly a facer, but Scotty came back in his usual calm manner. "I know it was Lanning, and it was a fine thing. I don't deny, either, that he's a fine gent in a lot of ways, and in his place. But is his place at the head of the gang? Are we going to be bullied into having him there? Then let him follow, and someone else lead." "You make me laugh, Jeff. He's not the sort that will follow anybody." Plainly Scotty was working on Jeff from a distance. He would bring him slowly around to the place where he would agree to the attack on Andrew for the sake of getting at the wounded marshal. "Have another drink, Jeff, and then let's get back to the main point, and that has nothing to do with Andy. It is Hal Dozier going to live or die?" The time had come, Andrew saw, to make his final play. A little bit more of this talk, and the big, good-hearted, strong-handed Rankin would be completely on the side of the others. And that meant the impossible odds of 4-1. Andrew knew it. He would attack any two of them without fear, but three became a desperate, a grim battle, and 4-1 made the thing suicide. He slipped silently to his feet from beside the door and picked up the canvas bag which represented his share of the robbery. Then he knocked at the door. "Boys," he called, "there's been some hard thoughts between the lot of you and me. It looks like we're on opposite sides of a fence. I want to come in and talk to you." Instantly Scotty answered, "Why, come on in, Captain. Not such hard words as you think. Not on my side, anyways." It was a cunning enough lure, no doubt, and Andrew had his hand on the latch of the door before a second thought reached him. If he exposed himself, would not the three of them pull their guns? They would be able to account for it to Jeff Rankin later on. "I'll come in," said Andrew, "when I hear you give me surety that I'll be safe. I don't trust you, Scotty." "Thanks for that. What surety do you want?" "I want the word of Jeff Rankin that he'll see me through till I've made my talk to you and my proposition." It was an excellent counter thrust, but Larry la Roche saw through the attempt to win Jeff immediately. "You skunk," he said, "if you don't trust us, we don't trust you. Stay where you be. We don't want to hear your talk." "Jeff, what do you say?" continued Andrew calmly. There was a clamor of three voices, and then the louder voice of Jeff, like a lion shaking itself clear of wolves. "Andy, come in, and I'll see you get a square deal, if you'll trust me." Instantly Andrew threw open the door and stepped in, his revolver in one hand, the heavy sack over his other arm, a dragging weight and also a protection. "I trust you, Jeff," he said. "Trust you? Why, man, with you at my back, I'd laugh at 20 fellows like these. They simply don't count." It was another well-placed shot, and he saw Rankin flush heavily with pleasure. Scotty tilted his box back against the wall and delivered his counterstroke. "He said the same thing to me earlier on in the evening," he remarked casually, "but I told him where to go. I told him that I was with the bunch first and last and all the time. That's why he hates me." End of chapter 39. Of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. While he searched desperately for an answer, Andrew found none. Then he saw the stupid big eyes of Jeff wander from his face to the face of Scotty, and he knew that his previous advantage had been completely neutralized. "Boys," he said, as he surveyed the restless, savage figures of Clune and La Roche, "I've come for a little plain talk. There's no more question about me leading the gang. None at all. I wouldn't lead you, La Roche, nor you, Clune, nor you, Scotty. There's only one man here that's clean, and he's Jeff Rankin." He waited for the point to sink home. As Scotty opened his lips to strike back, he went ahead deliberately. By retaining his own calm, he saw that he kept a great advantage. Rankin began fumbling at his cup. Scotty instantly filled it half full with whiskey. "Don't drink that," said Andrew sharply. "Don't drink it, Jeff. Scotty's doing that on purpose to get you sap-headed." "Do what he says," says Scotty calmly. "Throw the dirty stuff away, Jeff. Do what your daddy tells you. You ain't old enough to know your own mind, are you?" Big Jeff flushed, cast a glance of defiance that included both Andrew and Scotty, and tossed off the whiskey. It was a blow over the heart of Andrew. He had to finish his talking now, before Jeff Rankin was turned mad by the whiskey. And if he worked it well, Jeff would be on his side. the madness, would fight for Andrew. He said, "There's no more question about me being a leader for you. Personally, I'd like to have Jeff, not to follow me, but to be pals with me." Jeff cleared his throat and looked about with foolish importance. Not an eye wavered to meet his glance. Every look was fixed with a hungry hate upon Andrew. "There's only one thing up between the lot of us. Do I keep Hal Dozier, or do you get him to murder him? Do you fellows ride on your way free and easy to do what you please, or do you tackle me in that room, eat my lead, and then, if you finish me, get a chance to kill a man that's nearly dead now? How does it look to you, boys? Think it over. Think sharp." He knew while he spoke that there was one exquisitely simple way to end both his life and the life of Dozier. Let them touch a match to the building and shoot him while he ran from the flames. But he could only pray that they would not see it. "And besides, I'll do more. You think you have a claim on Dozier? I'll buy him from you. Here's half his weight in gold. Will you take the money and clear out, or are you going to make the play at me? If you do, you'll buy whatever you get at a high price." "You forget," put in Scotty, but Andrew interrupted. "I don't want to hear from you, Scotty. I know you're a snake. I want to hear from Jeff Rankin. Speak up, Jeff. Everything's in your hands, and I trust you." The giant rose from his chair. His face was white with the effect of the whiskey, and one spot of color burned in each cheek. He looked gloweringly upon his companions. "Andy," he said, "Wait a minute," said Scotty swiftly, seeing that the scales were balancing toward a defeat. "Let 'em talk. You don't have to tell 'em what to say," said Andrew. "I've got a right to put our side up to 'em for the sake of the things we've been through together. Jeff, have I?" Jeff Rankin cleared his throat importantly. Scotty faced him. The others kept their unchanging eyes riveted upon Andrew, ready for the gunplay at the first flicker of an eyelid. The first sign of unwariness would begin and end the battle. "Don't forget this," went on Scotty, having Jeff's attention. "Andy is working to keep Dozier alive. Why, Dozier's the law, isn't he? Then Andy wants to make up with the law. He wants to sneak out. He wants to turn state's evidence." That deadly phrase shocked Jeff Rankin a pace back towards soberness. "I never thought," he began. "You're too straight to think of it. Take another look at Lanning. Is he one of us? Has he ever been one of us? No. Look again. Dozier has hunted Lanning all over the mountain desert. Now he wants to save Dozier, wants to risk his life for him, wants to buy him from us. Why? Because he's turned crooked. He's turned soft. He wants to get under the wing of the law." But Jeff Rankin swept all argument away with a movement of his big paws. "Too much talk," he said. "I want to think." His stupid animal eyes went laboriously around the room. "I wish Allister were here," he said. "He always knew." "For my part," said Scotty, "I can't be bought. Not me." He suddenly leaned to the big man, and before Andrew could speak he had said, "Jeff, you know why I want to get Dozier. Because he ran down my brother. And are you going to let him go clear, Jeff? Are you going to have Allister haunt you?" It was the decisive stroke. The big head of Jeff twitched back. He opened his lips to speak, and in that moment, knowing the battle was over and lost to him, Andrew, who had moved back, made one leap and was through the door and into the little shed again. The gun had gleamed in the hand of Larry la Roche as he sprang, but Andrew had been too quick for the outlaw to plant his shot. He heard Jeff Rankin still speaking. "I don't know, quite, but I see you're right, Scotty. There ain't no reason for Lanning to be so chummy with Dozier. And so they must be something crooked about it. Boys, I'm with you to the limit. Go as far as you like. I'm behind you." No room for argument now, and the blind animal hate which Scotty and La Roche and Clune felt for Dozier was sure to drive them to extremities. Andrew sat in the dark, hurriedly going over his rifle and his revolver. Once he was about to throw open the door and try the effect of a surprise attack. He might plant 2 shots before there was a return. He let the idea slip away from him. There would remain 2 more, and one of them was certain to kill him. Moving across the room, he heard a whisper from the floor. "I've heard them, Lanning. Don't be a fool. Give me up to 'em." He made no answer. In the other room the voices were no longer restrained. Jeff Rankin's in particular boomed and rang and filled the shed. Once bent on action, he was all for attack. Whiskey had removed the last human scruple. Andrew heard them openly cast their ballots for a new leader, heard Scotty acclaimed, heard the Scotchman say, "Boys, I'm going to show you a way to clean up on Dozier and Lanning, without any man risking a single shot from him in return." They clamored for the suggestion, but he told them that he was first going out in the open to think it over. In the meantime, they had nothing to fear. Sit fast and have another drink around. He had to be alone to figure it out. It was very plain. The wily rascal would let them go one step farther towards an insanity of drink, and then, his own brain cold and collected, he would come back to turn the shack into a shambles. He had said that he could do it without risk to them. There was only one possible meaning. He intended to use fire. Andrew sat with the butt of his rifle ground into his forehead. It was still easy to escape. The insistent whisper from the floor was pointing out the way. "Beat it out the back window, lad. Slope. Andy, there's no use. You can't help me. They mean fire. They'll pot you like a pig from the dark. Give me up." It was the advice to use the window that decided Andrew. It was a wild chance indeed, this leaving of Dozier helpless on the floor, but he risked it. He whispered to the marshal that he would return, and slipped through the window. He was not halfway around the house before he heard a voice that chilled him with horror. It was the marshal calling to them that Andrew was gone and inviting them in to finish him. But they suspected naturally enough that the invitation was a trap, and they contented themselves with abusing him for thinking them such fools. Andrew went on. 50 feet from the house, and just aside from the shaft of light that fell from the open door, stood Scotty. His head was bare, his face was turned up to catch the wind, and no doubt he was dreaming of the future which lay before him as the new captain of Allister's band. The whisper of Andrew behind him cut his dream short. He whirled to receive the muzzle of a revolver in his stomach. His hands went up, and he stood gasping faintly in the moonlight. "I've got you, Scotty," he said, "and so help me heaven, you're the first man that I've wanted to kill." It would have taken a man of super nerve to outface that situation, and the nerve of Scotty cracked. He began to whisper with a horrible break and sob in his breath. "Andy, Andy, give me a chance. I'm not fit to go this way. Andy, remember." "I'm going to give you a chance. You're pretty low, Scotty. I check what you've done to the way you hate Dozier, and I won't hold a grudge. And I'll tell you the chance you've got. You see these rocks here? I'm going to lie down behind them. I'm going to keep you covered with my rifle. Scotty, did you ever see me shoot with a rifle?" Scotty shuddered. A very sufficient reply. "I'm going to keep you covered. Then you'll turn around and walk straight back to the shack. You'll stand there, always in clean sight of the doorway. You'll persuade that crowd of drunks to leave the house and ride away with you. Understand? When you get inside the house, there'll be a big temptation to jump to one side and get behind the wall. Just one twitch of your muscles and you'd be safe. but as fast as you could move, Scotty, powder drives lead a lot faster, and I'll have you centered every minute. You'll make a pretty little target against the light, besides. You understand? The moment you even start to move fast, I'll pull the trigger. Remember it, Scotty, for as sure as there's a hell, I'll send you into it head first, if you don't. So help me heaven, said Scotty. I'll do what I can. I think I can talk him into it, but if I don't? If you don't, you're dead. That's short, and that's sweet. Keep it in your head. Go back and tell them it would take too great a risk to try to fix me. And there's another thing to remember. If you should be able to get behind that wall without being shot, you're not safe. Not by a long way, Scotty. I'd still be alive, and though you'd have Dozier to cut up as you pleased, I'd be here outside the cabin watching it with my rifle, and I'd tag some of you when you tried to get out, and if I didn't get you all, I'd start on your trail. Scotty, you fellows, even when you had Allister to lead you, couldn't get off scot-free from Dozier. Scotty, I give you my solemn word of honor, you'll find me a harder man to get free of than Hal Dozier. Here's the last thing. If you do what I tell you, if you get that crowd of drunken brutes out of the cabin and away without harming Dozier, I'll wipe out the score between us. No matter what you've told the rest of 'em, you know I've never broken a promise, and that I never shall. He stopped, and stepping back to the rocks, sank slowly down behind them. Only the muzzle of his rifle showed, no more than the glint of a tiny bit of quartz. His left hand was raised, and at its gesture Scotty turned and walked slowly toward the cabin doorway. Once stumbling over something, he reeled almost out of the shaft of light, but stopped on the edge of safety with a terrible trembling. There he stood for a moment, and Andrew knew that he was gathering his nerve. He went on. He stood in the doorway, leaning with one arm against it. What followed Andrew could not hear, except an occasional roar from Rankin. Once Larry LaRoche came and stood before the new leader, gesturing frantically, and the ring of his voice came clearly to Andrew. The Scotchman negligently stood to one side. The way between Andrew and Larry was cleared, and Andrew could not help smiling at the fiendish malevolence of Scotty. But he was apparently able to convince even Larry LaRoche by means of words. At length there was a bustling in the cabin, a loud confusion, and finally the whole troop went out. Somebody brought Scotty his saddle. Jeff Rankin came out reeling. But Scotty stirred last from the doorway. There he stood in the shaft of light until someone, cursing, brought him his horse. He mounted it in full view. Then the cavalcade started down the ravine. Certainly it was not an auspicious beginning for Scotty McDougal. End of chapter 40. #41 of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The first 10 days of the following time were the hardest. It was during that period that Scotty and the rest were most apt to return and make a backstroke at Dozier and Andrew. For Andrew knew well enough that this was the argument, the promise of a surprise attack, with which Scotty had lured his men away from the shack. During that 10 days and later, he adopted a systematic plan of work. During the nights he paid 2 visits to the sick man. On one occasion he dressed the wound. On the next he did the cooking and put food and water beside the marshal to last him through the day. After that he went out and took up his post. As a rule he waited on the top of the hill in the clump of pines. From this position he commanded with his rifle the sweep of hillside all around the cabin. The greatest time of danger for Dozier was when Andrew had to scout through the adjacent hills for food. Their supply of meat ran out on the fourth day. But the 10 days passed, and after that, in spite of the poor care he had received, or perhaps aided by the absolute quiet, the marshal's iron constitution asserted itself more and more strongly. He began to mend rapidly. Eventually he could sit up, and when that time came, the great period of anxiety was over, for Dozier could sit with his rifle across his knees or leaning against the chair which Andrew had improvised, command a fairly good outlook. Only once, it was at the close of the fourth week, did Andrew find suspicious signs in the vicinity of the cabin. The telltale trampling on a place where 4 horses had milled in an impatient circle. But no doubt the gang had thought caution to be the better part of hate. They remembered the rifle of Andrew and had gone on without making a sign. Afterward Andrew learned why they had not returned sooner. 3 hours after they had left the shack, a posse had picked them up in the moonlight, and there had followed a 40-mile chase. But all through the time, until the marshal could actually stand and walk, and finally sit his saddle with little danger of injuring the wound, Andrew, knowing nothing of what took place outside, was ceaselessly on the watch. Literally, during all that period, he never closed his eyes for more than a few minutes of solid sleep, and before the danger line had been crossed he was worn to a shadow. When he turned his head, the cords leaped out on his neck. His mouth had that look, at once savage and nervous, which goes always with the hunted man. And it was not until he was himself convinced that Dozier could take care of himself that he wrapped himself in his blankets and fell into a 24-hour sleep. He awoke finally with a start out of a dream in which he had found himself, in imagination, wakened by Scotty stooping over him. He had reached for his revolver at his side in the dream and had found nothing. Now waking, his hand was working nervously across the floor of the shack. That part of the dream was come true. But instead of Scotty leaning over him, it was the marshal, who sat in his chair with his rifle across his knees. Andrew sat up. His weapons had been indeed removed, and the marshal was looking at him with beady eyes. "Have you seen 'em?" asked Andrew. "Have the boys showed themselves?" He started to get up, but the marshal's crisp voice cut in on him. "Sit down there." There had been, was it possible to believe it, a motion of the gun in the hands of the marshal to point this last remark. "Partner," said Andrew, stunned, "what are you driving at?" "I've been thinking," said Hal Dozier. "You sit tight till I tell you what about." "It's just drifting into my head, sort of misty," murmured Andrew, "that you've been thinking about double crossing me." "Suppose," said the marshal, "I was to ride into Martindale with you in front of me. That'd make a pretty good picture, Andy. Allister dead and you taken alive, not to speak of $10,000 as a background. That would sort of round off my work. I could retire and live happily ever after, eh?" Andrew peered into the grim face of the older man. There was not a flicker of a smile in it. "Go on," he said, "but think twice, Hal. If I was you, I'd think 10 times." The marshal met those terrible, blazing eyes without a quiver of his own. "I began with thinking about that picture," he said. "Later on I had some other thoughts about you. Andy, do you see that you don't fit around here? You're neither a man killer nor a law abiding citizen. You wouldn't fit in Martindale any more, and you certainly won't fit in with any gang of crooks that ever wore guns. Look at the way you split with Allister's outfit. Same thing would happen again. So, as far as I can see, it doesn't make much difference whether I trot you into town and collect the 10,000, or whether some crooks who hate you run you down, or some posse corners you one of these days and does its job. How do you see it?" Andrew said nothing, but his face spoke for him. "How do you see the future yourself?" said the marshal. His voice changed suddenly. "Talk to me, Andy." Andrew looked carefully at him. Then he spoke. "I'll tell you short and quick, Hal. I want action. That's all. I want something to keep my mind and my hands busy. Doing nothing is the thing I'm afraid of." "I gather you're not very happy, Andy." Lanning smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile to see. "I'm empty, Hal," he answered. "Does that answer you? The crooks are against me. The law is against me. Well, they work together to keep me busy. I don't want any man's help. I'm a bad man, Hal. I know it. I don't deny it. I don't ask any quarter." It was rather a desperate speech, rather a boyish one. At any rate, the marshal smiled, and a curious flush came into Andrew's face. "Will you let me tell you a story, Andrew? It's a story about yourself." He went on. "You were a kid in Martindale, husky, good natured, a little sleepy, with touchy nerves, not very confident in yourself. I've known other kids like you, but none just the same type. You weren't waked up, you see. The pinch was bound to come in a town where every man wore his gun. You were bound to face a showdown. There were equal chances. Either you'd back down or else you'd give the man a beating. If the first thing happened, you'd have been a coward the rest of your life. But the other thing was what happened, and it gave you a touch of the iron that a man needs in his blood. Iron dust, Andy, iron dust. You had bad luck, you think. You thought you killed a man. It made you think you were a born murderer. You began to look back to the old stories about the Lannings, a wild crew of men. You thought that blood was what was a showing in you. Partly you were right, partly you were wrong. There was a new strength in you. You thought it was the strength of a desperado. Do you know what the change was? It was the change from boyhood to manhood. That was all. A sort of chemical change, Andy. See what happened? You had your first fight, and you saw your first girl, all about the same time. But here's what puzzles me. According to the way I figure it, you must have seen the girl first, but it seems that you didn't. Will you tell me?" "We won't talk about the girl," said Andrew in a heavy voice. "Tut, tut, won't we? Boy, we're going to do more talking about her than about anything else. Well, anyway, you saw the girl, fell in love with her, and went away. Met up with a posse, which my brother happened to lead. Killed your man. Went on. Rode like the wind. Went through about 100 adventures in as many days. And little by little, you were fixing in your ways. You were changing from boyhood to manhood, and you were changing without any authority over you. Most youngsters have their father over them when that change comes. All of 'em have the law. But you didn't have either. And the result was that you changed from a boy into a man, and a free man. You hear me? You found that you could do what you wanted to do. Nothing could hold you back except one thing, the girl." Andrew caught his breath, but the marshal would not let him speak. "I've seen other free men. Most people call them desperados. What's a desperado in the real sense? A man who won't submit to the law. That's all he is. But because he won't submit, he usually runs foul of other men. He kills one, then he kills another. Finally he gets the bloodlust. Well, Andy, that's what you never got. You killed one man. He brought it on himself. But look back over the rest of your career. Most people think you've killed 20. That's because they've heard a pack of lies. You're a desperado, a free man, but you're not a man killer. And there's the whole point. And this was what turned you loose as a criminal. You thought the girl had cut loose from you. Otherwise, to this day, you'd have been trying to get away across the mountains and be a good, quiet member of society. But you thought the girl had cut loose from you, and it hurt you. Man killer? Bah! You're simply lovesick, my boy." "Talk slow," whispered Andrew. My head's whirling." "It'll whirl more pretty soon, Andy. Do you know that that girl never married Charles Merchant?" There was a wild yell. Andrew was stopped in midair by a rifle thrust into his stomach. "She broke off her engagement. She came to me because she knew I was running the manhunt. She begged me to let you have a chance. She tried to buy me. She told me everything that had gone between you. Andy, she put her head on my desk and cried while she was begging for you." "Stop," whispered Andrew. "But I wouldn't lay off your trail, Andy. Why? Because I'm as proud as a devil. I've started to get you, and I've lost Gray Peter trying. And even after you saved me from Allister's men, I was still figuring how I could get you. And then, little by little, I saw that the girl had seen the truth. You weren't really a crook. You weren't really a man killer. You were simply a kid that turned into a man in a day, and turned into a free man. You were too strong for the law. Now, Andrew, here's my point. As long as you stay here in the mountain desert, you've no chance. You'll be among men who know you. Even if the governor pardons you, as he might do if a certain deputy marshal were to start pulling strings, you'd run some day into a man who had an old grudge against you, and there'd be another explosion. Because there's nitroglycerin inside you, son. Well, the thing for you to do is to get where men don't wear guns. The thing for you to do is to find a girl you love a lot more than you do your freedom, even if that's possible." "Where is she?" broke in Andy. "Hal, for pity's sake, tell me where she is." "I've got her address all written out. She forgot nothing. She left it with me, she said, so she could keep in touch with me." "It's no good," said Andrew suddenly. "I could never get through the mountains. People know me too well. They know Sally too well." "Of course they do. So you're not going to go with Sally. You're not going to ride a horse. You're going in another way. Everybody's seen your picture, but who'd recognize the dashing young man killer, the original wild Andrew Lanning, in the shape of a greasy, dirty tramp, with a 10-days-old beard on his face, with a dirty felt hat pulled over one eye, and riding the brake beams on the way east? And before you got off the beams, Andrew, the governor of this state will have signed a pardon for you. Well, lad, what do you say?" But Andrew, walking like one dazed, had crossed the room slowly. The marshal saw him go across to the place where Sally stood. She met him halfway, and in her impudent way tipped his hat half off his head with a toss of her nose. He put his arm around her neck, and they walked slowly off together. "Well," said Hal Dozier faintly, "what can you do with a man who don't know how to choose between a horse and a girl?" End of Chapter 41. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of Way of the Lawless by Max Brand.